Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. Do remember that if you'd like to become a patron of the podcast, you can do so at patreon.com/the History Network. Thank you to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, season 39, episode 2, Buried Alive, Operation Tracer and the Secret of Gibraltar. This episode was written by Richard Clements. Richard has held a keen interest in the Second World War for most of his life. He enjoys uncovering the lesser-known and unusual stories of the conflict and bringing them to life for new audiences. Richard has written for us before, you may remember. In the Second World War, the Rock of Gibraltar stood like a sentinel at the gateway to the Mediterranean. Whoever held it could open or close the sea lanes to North Africa and beyond. To Britain it was a vital stronghold, but by 1940 it looked vulnerable. Spain was under Franco's rule, sympathetic to Berlin, and German planners drew up schemes to seize the fortress in one swift move. It was in this climate that a plan was conceived that bordered on the unimaginable. A small group of men would vanish from the surface of the rock and take up residence in a chamber hollowed out within its limestone core. They would not leave again until the war ended. Their new world was stark and narrow. The main room was little more than a stone vault, lined with cork to muffle every sound. At one end, 2 slits, no wider than a hand, could be pushed open to look out over the bay and the strait. There was no daylight, only lamps. Food came in tins and boxes stacked along the walls, enough for years rather than months. A tank held thousands of gallons of water. A bicycle rigged to a generator would keep the radio alive and the air circulating. The rules of survival were unbending. Silence at all times. If one of them died, the others were to embalm the body and set it in concrete so that the mission could continue. The 6 men chosen to carry out this accepted the possibility that they might never step outside again. This was Operation Tracer. For decades it existed only as a rumour told in Gibraltar's pubs and barracks. Then, half a century later, the sealed chamber was found, still holding the traces of the mission that never began. In the summer of 1940, Britain was reeling. France had collapsed. German forces lined the Channel. Bombers were striking London and other cities every night. To the south lay another point of weakness. At the mouth of the Mediterranean, Gibraltar stood like a stone watchtower, 3 miles long and impossible to miss. Whoever held it could decide which ships passed between the Atlantic and the inner sea. Hitler's planners quickly saw its value. They sketched out a scheme to bring Spain into the war and then send German troops racing down to the peninsula. If Franco agreed, Gibraltar could be battered by artillery from the north while engineers forced a way through its outer defences. Infantry would follow across the narrow land bridge, aiming to take the rock in a single thrust. Had it worked, the Axis would have been able to watch every Allied convoy sailing east and west, threatening the routes that supplied Malta, Egypt and the Suez Canal. Britain's lifeline to the Middle East would have been in serious danger. The pressure on the Royal Navy would have increased at once. Convoys already stalked by U-boats would have had to run a gauntlet overlooked by hostile guns. London could not ignore the possibility. The fortress looked secure on the surface, but in truth it was vulnerable. The town at its base could be shelled from Spanish guns. The garrison relied entirely on food and fuel brought by sea. If Gibraltar was cut off, it might not last long. The governor and his staff oversaw frantic preparations. New galleries blasted into the rock. Ammunition stores moved underground. Decoys and camouflage spread across the upper slopes. But however strong the defences grew, The same question nagged at planners. What if the place fell? The responsibility for preparing a response fell to Rear Admiral John Henry Godfrey, head of naval intelligence. Godfrey was a determined man, known for pressing unusual ideas when the situation called for them. At his house in Curzon Street in London he gathered a small circle of advisers. Among them was his aide, a young officer named Ian Fleming. Fleming would later become famous as the creator of James Bond, but in those years he was simply an officer on the intelligence staff, valued for his imagination and his willingness to think outside the conventional. Together they began to consider a strange possibility. If the rock were overrun, could a team remain inside it, hidden, watching silently as the enemy took control outside? The men would need a way to live undetected for months or even years. They would need supplies, water, power, and above all a means of sending reports back to the Allies. It was the kind of idea that could not be discussed openly. Instead, it was explored quietly, with only a few trusted officers kept in the loop. Fleming was asked to help draw up arrangements. On the rock itself, British engineers and tunnellers were already carving galleries deep into the limestone to strengthen the defences. Within that expanding maze there might be room for something entirely new, a chamber, not meant for troops to come and go, but for 6 men to be sealed away and left to their fate. As sketches turned into plans, the concept widened beyond simple concealment. The chamber would need to be silent, odourless, and invisible from the outside. It would have to withstand not only bombardment, but the monotony of time, and it would have to allow the hidden men to see without being seen. By 1941 the idea had a name and a purpose that could be summarised in a sentence. Operation Tracer would keep watch if Gibraltar fell. Once the idea of Operation Tracer had been accepted, the real difficulty began. It was one thing to sketch a plan on paper, quite another to create a chamber in solid limestone where 6 men could live for years without giving themselves away. The choice of location was vital. High on the north face of the rock, near Lord Airy's battery, British engineers were already cutting new galleries to strengthen the defences. Among those works a more secret excavation began. The approach was chosen for its awkwardness. The harder it was to reach, the safer the men would be once they were inside. The digging was carried out by ordinary labourers, many of whom never knew what they were shaping. Some were deliberately kept in the dark, brought in under escort and led blindfolded through the tunnels so they could not return later with directions. Behind the drills and chisels the stone slowly opened up into a rectangular room. It measured roughly the length of a double-decker bus and was wide enough for a handful of bunks, shelves and a working table. In the context of Gibraltar's cramped galleries it seemed large, though in reality it was little more than a cave. From this main space narrow corridors ran off to the bare essentials, a cooking corner, a small latrine, and a tight niche set aside for the radio set. The bunks were planned to be simple frames stacked along one wall. Hooks for clothing and kit were marked out so nothing would clatter to the floor in the night. The outside view came only through 2 slits, one facing east over the Mediterranean and the other west towards the bay. They were no more than a hand's width, and from outside they looked like nothing at all, just irregular patches of stone and mortar. Each slit bent slightly within the wall to break up sound and light. A man at the aperture could see vessels sliding below, but anyone searching from the outside would find only rough rock. Every detail had been considered with secrecy in mind. The floor was covered with cork so that the boots made no sound. The walls were smoothed over to reduce echoes. Even the way the men breathed was thought about. A bicycle bolted to the floor drove a small generator that powered the radio batteries and also pushed air around the chamber. The chain was muffled to stop its hum from carrying beyond the rock. A hand-cranked backup sat ready in case the bicycle failed. Supplies filled every spare corner. At first the planners imagined a single year of endurance, but as the design evolved, the stockpile grew. Crates of food and medical stores were stacked against the walls, tins of meat and milk, drums of fuel and boxes of candles and batteries. A huge tank was sunk into the stone to hold thousands of gallons of water. To ward off boredom, books and simple games were added to the lists. The men would live by routine. Meals at set hours, exercise on the bicycle, short watches at the slits. Cleaning done carefully so dust did not clog the ducts. At the centre of the plan sat the wireless set. This was the only reason for the chamber's existence. The operators would use it to send short-coded messages, nothing more than a few bursts of Morse, describing the movement of enemy ships. Signals would be brief and timed to reduce the risk of enemy direction finding. The aerial itself was a thin rod that could be pushed out through the eastern slit when needed and pulled back inside again so there were no signs to a passing eye. Perhaps the most chilling order concerned death. If one of the men did not survive the long vigil, the others were instructed to embalm the body as best they could, then entomb it in concrete so the mission could continue without interruption. Every part of the plan was shaped by the same ruthless priority. The mission mattered more than the individual. And there were other small rules that showed how carefully the designers had imagined life in the cave. Water would be rationed to the pint. Rubbish would be burnt in a small sealed unit or packed away to prevent smell. Any metalwork likely to rattle in a draught would be wrapped in cloth. The only light would be from shaded bulbs, arranged to mimic a day and night rhythm. Nothing was left to chance. By the middle of 1942, the chamber was ready. To anyone passing outside, it was just another bricked gallery among the rock's many defences. To the handful of men in the know, it was something else entirely. A stone cage prepared for 6 living occupants with no certainty of release. The chamber was one thing, but men had to be found to live inside it. Not just anyone could be trusted with such a task. They would need medical skill, technical knowledge, stamina, and above all the temperament to endure years of confinement with no prospect of escape. The search for suitable volunteers fell partly to George Murray Levick, a naval surgeon with an unusual background. He had been a member of Captain Scott's Antarctic expedition before the Great War and had survived months of near starvation in an ice cave on a bleak shore. That winter taught him how quickly routine can save a life. His experience of isolation and survival made him the perfect man to advise on what would be required. Levick helped select the team, advised on diet and exercise, and set down rules for how they should cope with boredom and stress. The final group numbered 6. At their head was an officer nicknamed Windy Gale, chosen for his steadiness of character. Alongside him were 2 doctors, Surgeon Lieutenant Bruce Cooper, a naval physician in his 20s, and another medical officer, Dr. Martin Milner. The rest of the team were wireless operators, skilled in radio work but otherwise anonymous, their names never recorded in official accounts. The men were told what would be expected of them. They listened as the details were laid out. They would be sealed behind a wall, cut off from daylight, surviving on tins and dried rations. They would never be able to stretch their legs in the open air. They would never walk freely through the town below. Their only duty would be to remain alive and keep the radio transmitting. If one of them died, the others would set the body in concrete and continue. Remarkably, they agreed. For Cooper and Milner it was not so very different from the hardships of naval service, only more extreme. For Gale and the operators it was a test of loyalty and endurance. None of them knew whether the plan would ever be activated, but all accepted that if the order came, they would step into the chamber and the wall would close behind them. Training was carried out in Britain before the team was dispatched to Gibraltar. Early ideas suggested rehearsals in a cave in Scotland, but in the end the men were housed in a remote farmhouse on Romney Marsh. There they lived under a form of confinement, testing how they coped with close quarters and constant companionship. Levick lived among them, watching carefully for signs of strain or conflict. He noted how they ate, how they passed their time, how they handled irritation and fatigue. Arguments were resolved by rule rather than rank, to keep tempers from settling into resentments. Cards, chess, and reading were encouraged. Silence at set times helped men retreat into themselves, without seeming rude. The medical training was practical. Minor injuries would have to be treated in place, dental problems planned for in advance, diet balanced to prevent deficiency. Exercise on the bicycle became part of the day. The men learnt to manage the radio kit in the dark by touch alone, in case a light had to be doused quickly. They practised sending short messages with gloved hands, and they practised the same message again until it became muscle memory. By the summer of 1942 the training was complete. The men travelled to Gibraltar under cover identities, each assigned a notional role within the garrison, so that their presence would arouse no suspicion. Their real task was to wait. If Hitler's forces swept across Spain, they would vanish into the rock, and Gibraltar would not be entirely blind. To those who knew of it, Operation Tracer was more than a contingency plan. It was a leap into the unknown, a gamble on human endurance. The chamber was ready, the men were in place. All that remained was for history to test whether such an extraordinary plan would ever be used. By late 1942 the chamber was finished and the men were prepared. All the pieces were in place for Operation Tracer. Yet the order to activate it never came. The fate of the plan now rested on the progress of the wider war. The team remained in Gibraltar under cover. They went about ordinary duties by day, never speaking openly of the role that awaited them. If the signal had been given they would have slipped away into the tunnels, carrying only what they could, and watched the entrance be sealed behind them. The wall would have been bricked over, making the chamber invisible among the maze of galleries. From that moment they would have lived by routine alone, rotating shifts at the observation posts, short bursts on the radio, rationed meals, and endless hours of silence. For the doctors, the task was to keep bodies and minds intact. For the wireless operators, it was to keep the fragile link with the outside world alive. And for the officer in charge, it was simply to maintain order. Day after day, year after year, they had plans for the first week, plans for the first month, and quiet hopes for the first Christmas underground, if it came to that. But events outside the rock were shifting fast. In November 1942 the Allies launched Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. Landings at Algiers, Oran and Casablanca brought French territories over to the Allied side. Within months Axis forces were driven out of Tunisia. The threat that German troops might pour through Spain began to recede. Franco, cautious as ever, kept his country out of the fighting. Gibraltar, once thought to be within reach of German assault, seemed to be moving out of danger. Then, in the summer of 1943, the Allies struck at Sicily. On the 9th of July, the invasion began. By mid-August the island was secure and Mussolini had been deposed. The Mediterranean war was changing shape. Gibraltar was no longer the keystone it had been in 1940. The need for a hidden garrison inside the rock faded with each Allied advance. In London, the order was given to stand the tracer team down. On 24th of August 1943, the Director of Naval Intelligence issued final instructions. Conduct one last radio test, close the chamber, distribute the remaining provisions. The mission for which 6 men had trained so long was quietly shelved. The volunteers were thanked for their service and sworn to secrecy. The chamber was sealed and left as part of the Rock's hidden warren. For the rest of the war it lay silent. The men returned to their regular duties, carrying with them the knowledge of what might have been. In messes and wardrooms they kept their promise, and the story fell into that half-light where truth sounds like folklore. For decades afterwards, no official mention of Operation Tracer appeared. To those outside the intelligence world, it was nothing more than a rumour. Gibraltarians swapped stories in cafes and pubs of a secret chamber where men were to be entombed alive, but without evidence it remained a legend. Even among the soldiers who had served on the Rock, it was spoken of as hearsay. Yet beneath the limestone, sealed behind a brick wall, the chamber endured. The cork floor, the bicycle generator, the empty tank, all lay waiting, untouched, as though still prepared for the day the order might come. For half a century, Operation Tracer remained little more than a whisper. Old soldiers recalled hints of it, locals swapped tales of a cave hidden somewhere on the Rock, and writers speculated that the story might be true, but there was no proof. The files were locked away and the site itself was sealed. That changed in December 1997. Members of the Gibraltar caving group, who had long heard the rumours, were exploring a section of tunnels near Lord Airy's battery. Behind a bricked wall they found a narrow passage, and beyond it the chamber itself. Dust lay thick, but the layout was unmistakable. The explorers found the traces of a life that had never been lived. The cork floor was still in place, the water tank stood empty but intact. On one side sat the frame of a bicycle, rusted and broken, once meant to drive the generator and circulate the air. Pipes still led to the observation slits, and in the walls the tiny openings remained, looking out across the bay and the strait. A tap was turned experimentally, black water coughed out, then ran clear. It was as if the room had held its breath for 50 years and exhaled at last. News of the discovery spread quickly. Historians confirmed that this was indeed the hidden cave, prepared for Operation Tracer. A builder who had worked on the site came forward to describe his part in the excavation, recalling how the project had been disguised and how secrecy had been enforced. For the first time, the legend had tangible form. The measurements in old papers matched what the cavers found. The slits looked where they were meant to look. The place felt unfinished and ready at the same time. One man in particular was able to close the circle. Dr. Bruce Cooper, one of the 2 naval doctors selected for the mission, was still alive. In the early 2000s he returned to Gibraltar and was taken to the site. Walking into the chamber he recognised it at once. This was the place where he had expected to spend perhaps 7 years of his life. He spoke of the training, of the secrecy, and of the grim instructions they had been given. His visit provided final confirmation that the story was no myth but a real plan, abandoned only because the war had turned in Britain's favour. Cooper died in 2010 at the age of 96, the last living link to the men who had been ready to vanish into the Rock. Today the chamber is preserved as part of Gibraltar's heritage. Visitors can see the stark space with its slits and alcoves, a reminder of a scheme that was as audacious as it was unsettling. Guides explain how the bicycle worked, where the radio would have been, where the bunks ran along the wall. People step out, blinking into daylight, and talk in low voices without quite knowing why. Operation Tracer was never carried out, yet it remains one of the most extraordinary contingency plans of the Second World War. At its heart lay a simple idea. Even if Britain lost Gibraltar, the enemy would never hold it unobserved. To achieve that, 6 men were prepared to surrender freedom, daylight, and perhaps even life itself, in order to serve. The chamber tells its own story. It is not large, nor is it elaborate, but every corner speaks of endurance. The cork tiles, the bunk spaces, the empty water tank, the silent observation slits, all of it was built with human survival in mind, pared down to what was essential. What strikes visitors now is the sheer weight of commitment that the plan demanded. War often asks for courage in a moment. This asked for courage that would have to last for years. The men who volunteered were not household names. They were doctors and wireless operators, officers and specialists whose duty might have left them forgotten behind a wall of stone. Yet their willingness to take part is a reminder of how far ordinary individuals were asked to go in the service of a larger cause. The story resonates because it places the grand currents of strategy against the small constancy of human routine. A kettle boiled on a primus stove, a page turned in a book, a minute of Morse sent at an appointed hour. Nothing heroic in appearance, yet all of it essential. In the end, the war moved on. North Africa was secured, Sicily fell, and the danger passed. The chamber was sealed, the files locked away, and the men dispersed. Only in later years did the truth emerge, carried first by rumour and then by discovery. Today, standing inside the space carved high on the rock, one cannot help but imagine the silence that would have fallen if the plan had gone ahead, the creak of the bicycle chain, the tap of the Morse code, the whispered exchanges between men who knew they might never leave. Operation Tracer was never tested, but its existence is a testament to resilience, ingenuity, and the extreme demands of wartime. It is a reminder that history is not only written in battles and victories, but also in the hidden sacrifices that were prepared, even if they were never called upon. Well, thank you so much for writing that episode for us, Richard. And if you would like to write an episode for us, then just drop us a line, info@thehistorynetwork.org for that. And also, please do consider becoming one of our patrons by going to patreon.com/The History Network. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the historynetwork.org podcast, written by Richard Clements, read by Nick Barker.